Have you ever wondered what someone says when they know they are going to die? What if that person was a murderer in front of the judge with the seconds counting? What might go through someone's mind in that final moment? Regret, anger, indifference? The last words of a person sentenced to death carry a weight that is difficult to describe. They are like a distorted mirror of the soul, revealing fragments of humanity, madness, or deep remorse. On some occasions, these final statements are so impactful that they become eternal, echoing far beyond the walls of a prison or execution room. Throughout history, countless notorious criminals have left behind memorable phrases before being executed. Some of these phrases sound like belated confessions, others like icy provocations, almost defying death. There are still those that surprise with their serenity, as if the person were at peace with the destiny they created. But what do these last words really say about who these people were? Can a murderer, with just one sentence, change the way the world sees him? Or worse, could it leave a cruel doubt planted in the minds of those who heard it? Stay with me until the end, because what you will discover now may surprise you, and maybe even make you rethink the power of words. This theme is much more than a morbid curiosity. He makes us reflect on human nature, repentance, and even the role of justice. When listening to what was said in those final moments, we are confronted with something that goes beyond the crime itself. We are brought face to face with the emotional legacy of a life marked by extreme decisions. Imagine the tension in the air, absolute silence before the final words, the fixed gaze, the time counted. Each syllable takes on an almost unbearable weight, and when they are finally said, the impact can be devastating for victims, for families, for law enforcement, and even for us listening on the sidelines. Have you ever been through this? Have you ever had goosebumps hearing the final sentence of someone who knew their life was about to end? It's almost impossible not to get involved, even for a moment. In this video, we'll dive into some of the most iconic and disturbing cases involving the last words of convicted criminals. And more than just repeating them, let's try to understand what's behind each one, the emotions, the contexts, the hidden intentions. After all, at a time when there is nothing left to lose, that is when the crudest truth often comes to light. And in the next block, you will learn about the most impressive stories, some tragic, others shocking, but all absolutely real. Some of these final sentences are so powerful that they seem to stop time. Like when a killer looks the audience in the eye, takes a deep breath and says something no one expected to hear. It can be a request for forgiveness, a cry of revolt, or even a macabre joke. And, as strange as it may seem, all of this touches us in some way. Because behind each case, no matter how dark it may be, there is a human story that provokes us, challenges us, and sometimes makes us see nuances that we would prefer to ignore. If this topic makes sense to you, leave here in the comments what has touched you most so far. Have you ever heard or read someone's last sentence and felt that shiver, that doubt, that internal silence that is difficult to explain? Share with us. Your experience can resonate with other people, and it is precisely this exchange that transforms this space into something much deeper than just a video. And if you liked this type of approach, if this more human and provocative look makes you reflect, click the like button. This helps the video reach more people who may also be interested in topics like this. And of course, subscribe to the channel to continue following this dive into real stories that touch our minds and hearts. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and keeps this conversation that we started together alive. And what comes now is even more intense. Get ready to hear final statements that defy logic, confront morals, and reveal the darkest, and at times surprisingly human, side of these characters who marked history with blood and words. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject. Because when we talk about the last words of a condemned man, we are not just listening to loose phrases. We are going behind the scenes of a mind that lived on the edge, that crossed all the boundaries of what is right or wrong. We are faced with a human being who for a moment knows that tomorrow no longer exists, and at that moment, something breaks inside. It's as if all the masks fell, all the justifications, all the armor created over a lifetime. And what's left? Sometimes just silence, other times a hidden truth that haunts us to this day. In many of these accounts, what strikes most is not the violence of the crimes, but the brutal contrast between the past and that final moment. Imagine someone who spent years denying any guilt, and who in the last seconds decides to confess, not just what he did, but why. It is as if there in the face of death there was a silent transformation, a rupture of mentality that arrives too late. Some say this is just fear. Could it be? But it can also be something deeper, the need to leave a last mark, to try to give new meaning to a life of choices that have no return, and this mark does not always come in the form of regret. In some cases, what you hear is pure coldness, as if the person refused until the end to give up any trace of vulnerability. These last words, in these cases, sound like a last act of control, as if the condemned person were saying, "You can take my life, but you will not have my repentance." And that says a lot about what was behind that mind. A trace of pride, of anger, of deep denial. In these short sentences, we see a complete portrait of who the person was, or who they chose to be until the last second. There are also those who try to give meaning to their own existence with a final statement. They talk about faith, love, forgiveness, even when the past is full of pain and destruction. And as difficult as it is to hear this from a killer, we need to admit there is something there that forces us to look deeper, because it's impossible not to wonder, can anyone change even after everything? Is there any kind of redemption when time is up? This is where the topic takes on another dimension. We are not just talking about crimes and punishments. We are talking about impact, about choices that shape destinies, about the human need to be understood, even if too late. And this need appears in the details, in the tone of voice, in the expression of the eyes, in the pause before the last sentence. Everything carries an almost unbearable weight. Each syllable can carry decades of pain, revolt, or desperate search for some kind of peace. And the most intriguing thing is that often these final words do not serve to alleviate anything. They serve to leave a wound even more open, in those who listen, in those who survived, in those who stayed. Because the truth is that not every story needs a beautiful ending. Sometimes the end is just the echo of everything that was left unresolved. A sentence may not redeem, but it can reveal. It can illuminate a part of the journey that has never been understood. It can provoke a reflection that keeps pounding in the head of whoever heard it. And maybe, just maybe, it will transform the way that person sees the world. And this brings us to another essential point, the fine line between justice and revenge, between punishing and understanding. When we hear these last words, we are forced to revisit our own beliefs. It's uncomfortable, I know, but perhaps that is exactly what this type of content provokes, an uncomfortable but necessary reflection. Because behind brutality, there is always a trajectory, and understanding these trajectories is not a waste of time. It's about seeking clarity. It's looking more honestly at what we are capable of doing, and at what we are capable of feeling, in the face of what the other has done. Perhaps that is the true power of these final words. Not to absolve, but to awaken, to shed light on the darkest corners of the human soul, and remind us that no matter how much we try to separate the good from the bad into perfect little boxes, real life is made up of nuances. of complex decisions, of intertwined stories, of pain that lasts for generations. Write it in the comments. I'm on this journey too. I really want to know what all this does to you. Now, I want to go even deeper into this subject because when we observe the last words of a convicted person in the light of criminal psychology, what is revealed goes far beyond the surface. It's not just what is said, it's what as is said. The intonation, the look, the time of silence before the sentence, all of this counts. And it is precisely these details that help experts identify behavioral patterns, personality traits, and even defense mechanisms that remain active until the last seconds of life. There is intense emotional tension in this final moment, and it can either reveal genuine regret or reveal cold and calculated narcissism. In clinical practice and forensic studies, this final moment is watched carefully because it tends to be a raw reflection of the mental journey that the individual has traveled. It is there that the most evident signs of transformation, or the total lack thereof, appear. For example, when a killer chooses to use his last words to manipulate the narrative, placing himself as a victim, as someone misunderstood or wronged, this says a lot about his internal structure. It's a typical pattern of narcissistic profiles, where the need to control one's own image persists until the last second. And as absurd as it may sound, this control over external perception can be, for these people, more important than life itself. On the other hand, when the convict shows true empathy, when he mentions the names of the victims, recognizes the damage caused and shows deep regret, with not only verbal but also visible emotional signs, scholars focus on this behavior as something rare but possible. In these cases, there is a pattern break. It is as if in the final moments there was actually an awareness, an emotional opening that was previously blocked, whether due to trauma, cognitive distortions, or pure denial. And this type of revelation affects us because it comes up against our own notion of justice. If someone committed something unforgivable, can they still access a legitimate human feeling in the end? And if so, what does that change? For the victims, for society, for us who observe? This is the question that echoes in many silent courtrooms, where eyes are focused on the defendant, not just waiting for a confession, but trying to decipher whether there is a trace of emotional truth there. Now, it is also important to understand that not all silence in this context means coldness. In many cases, the absence of words can reveal a kind of internal collapse, a psychic exhaustion, an emotional void that accompanies deeply dissociated personalities. When the subject looks at death without saying a single sentence, psychology professionals see this as a kind of final block, the impossibility of constructing meaning, even knowing that this is the last possible moment to do so. There is also the type that turns the moment into a stage. He makes an elaborate speech, provokes the audience, cites religious or political references, uses strong words as if he were participating in a great act. This is also significant. Often this behavior reveals an intense need to remain at the center of the narrative, even through shock. It is the ego seeking a kind of symbolic immortality. And when that happens, what you see is a living portrait of the mind that refuses to disappear without leaving a mark, even if that mark is one of pain or provocation. All of this helps us realize that these last phrases do not come out of nowhere. They are, in fact, the end product of a long chain of decisions, experiences, traumas, and distortions accumulated throughout life. Each sentence spoken on death row carries the layers of the complex story, full of psychological curves and emotional forks. And it is precisely at this point that psychology comes in as a powerful lens. She shows us that behind a brutal crime, there is almost always a tortuous psychic construction made up of old wounds, distorted values, and often a profound disconnection with the very meaning of existence. When we look at it from this angle, we begin to understand why some convicts ask for forgiveness with tears in their eyes, while others smile coldly and say phrases like, "It was fun." This is not just a moral deviation. These are personality structures that deal with guilt, fear, and death in completely different ways. And this has a direct impact not only on the way the system deals with these cases, but also on the way we, as a society, choose to judge, condemn, and remember these people. There is an essential component to this discussion that often goes unnoticed: the symbolic power of these last words. They not only affect those who say them, but everyone around them: police officers, judges, journalists, victims' families. Everyone carries these phrases with them, often for years. And this shapes mentalities. It reinforces beliefs or destroys convictions. That is why, for criminal psychology, the moment of execution is also a moment of deep observation of the human psyche. A moment where, between the end and the eternal, something reveals itself. Comment there. That makes sense. To me, I want to know how much this topic moves you. Right now, I want to go even deeper into this subject, because understanding what happens in the mind of a person sentenced to death requires more than just hearing their final words. You have to look at what came before, at the signs he left along the journey, especially when that convict is someone like Gary Gilmore. Many people know his final sentence: simple, direct, without flourishes. Let's go. But few know what he said before that, still in court, when he had the chance to speak to the world. And the contrast between these two lines is so striking that it is disturbing. Gilmore was the first to be executed in the United States after the death penalty was reinstated in 1976. He became a controversial symbol of the American penal system, but also of human complexity in the face of death. His case was marked by the coldness with which he dealt with his own destiny. He not only accepted the sentence, but demanded that it be carried out as quickly as possible. He rejected all possible appeals, refused to appeal, and seemed determined to die, as if there was no more room for redemption, or perhaps as if that end were, for him, a liberation. But before the execution, when he was still in front of the judge, he said a sentence that was forgotten by many, but which says a lot about what was going on inside him. He looked straight ahead and said, "Why kill me for something that is already dead inside?" This sentence packs a punch. It reveals a hidden pain, an internal bankruptcy that cannot be seen in the eyes of someone calm and determined. Behind the man who asked to be killed, there was a shattered soul, unable to find any meaning in staying alive, and this is where we need to look more sensitively, because this statement reveals something that goes beyond the crime. It shows the collapse of someone who had already condemned himself inside, long before justice officially did so. The transformation that could perhaps happen no longer made sense to him. The pain, the guilt, or perhaps the emptiness, all of it had eaten away at what was left. And even though he maintained a tough and objective stance until the end, that single sentence said there in court reveals a hidden truth. He was already emotionally dead. The execution was just the outcome of an internal process of self-destruction. This makes us think about the impact of decisions, not only legal, but emotional and existential. Because when someone chooses their own death with such coldness, what is at stake is not only the crime committed, but the entire life history, the accumulated wounds, the losses that shaped that human being. It's not trying to justify it. It's trying to understand. And this understanding is what allows us to see the invisible layers behind stories like this. Gilmore did not ask for forgiveness. He didn't cry. He didn't try to defend himself. But he left enough clues for us to realize that something in him, deep down, had already fallen apart long before the execution. And perhaps precisely for this reason, his last sentence was so brief. Let's go. 3 words that may seem empty, but carry total commitment, the absence of resistance, the acceptance of an end that for him had already begun a long time ago. Write it in the comments. That makes sense to me. I want to know how this story resonated with you. By the way, I want to go even deeper into this subject, because if in the case of Gary Gilmore, what impacts us most is silent pain disguised as indifference, with Ted Bundy, the sensation is completely different. What shocks us is not what he hides, but what he don't feel. Bundy was one of the most famous and studied murderers in criminal history, not only for the brutal crimes he committed, but for the way he manipulated everything and everyone around him. Extremely intelligent, articulate, charismatic, and absolutely cold. A classic profile of psychopathy, which challenged even the most experienced professionals to find any trace of real empathy in that calm and controlled look. During the trial, Bundy showed not the slightest trace of remorse. He defended himself brilliantly, almost as if he were acting, and maybe he was. His speeches were coldly calculated to maintain control of the narrative. He knew the weight of words. He knew how to shape his own image in front of the cameras and the jury, and he used it as a weapon. The most disturbing thing, however, is not just the crimes he committed, but the fact that he seemed completely alien to the emotional consequences of what he did. It was as if the pain of others was not part of his world. When he was finally convicted and given the chance to speak, many expected a moment of humanity, a request for forgiveness perhaps, a break. But what was heard was a sentence that reflected exactly who he was inside. Goodbye. Please give my love to my family and friends. Just that. No mention of the victims, no confession, no trace of guilt, just one last act, carefully rehearsed to seem normal, almost sensitive, and yet absolutely empty. This type of posture, according to criminal psychology, reveals a very clear pattern of deep emotional detachment. Coldness is not a momentary resource, it is part of the structure. It is the absence of what connects us to others: empathy, remorse, guilt. And that's precisely what makes cases like Bundy's so difficult to understand. Because he knew exactly what he was doing, but he never allowed himself to feel the weight of what he did. Write it in the comments. I'm on this journey too. I want to know how this kind of emotional coldness impacts you. Taking advantage, I want to go even deeper into this subject, because when religion enters the scene in the final moments of a condemned person, the layers of interpretation multiply. For some, it is a sign of genuine transformation. For others, a control strategy, an attempt to rewrite history itself. And in the case of John Wayne Gacy, the impact of that choice was as confusing as it was disturbing. Known as the Killer Clown, Gacy was convicted of the brutal deaths of 33 young people. Behind the facade of a respectable citizen and a party clown, he hid one of the darkest minds ever investigated in the field of criminal psychology. What caught attention in his final moments was the use of faith as his last speech. Before being executed, Gacy recited a biblical quote and then asked for forgiveness. But the request was not accompanied by emotion, visible regret, or even direct mention of the victims. It sounded almost technical, as if he was following a protocol. And this raised a question that many experts debate to this day. To what extent is religiosity in these cases part of a true inner transformation? And when does it become an emotional shield or a carefully planned act? For psychology, this behavior can be interpreted in 2 ways. One of them is the use of faith as a defense mechanism, a way of trying to deal with the imminence of death and the weight of what has been done. Saying, "I regret it," or "May God forgive me," can act as a symbolic relief, a gesture that calms even if inside the conscience remains intact. But there is also the other side, religion used as a tool of manipulation until the last second. A new character created to soften public judgment, preserve image in front of the family, or even confuse those listening. In Gacy's case, what makes everything even more intriguing is that, even after this supposed act of faith, his last words were full of irony. He said, "Kiss my ass." 3 words that contradict everything that had been said before, as if in the end religion had been just another mask that he knew how to wear so well throughout his life. And that says a lot about mentality, about the way some individuals deal with their own end, not as a moment of revelation, but as another scene in a carefully staged theater. Write it in the comments. That makes sense to me. I want to know how you interpret this type of behavior. So now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because among all the stories that cross death rows, few generate as much uneasiness as that of someone who claims, until the last second, that they shouldn't be there. Cameron Todd. Willingham is that name that echoes like a question mark in the history of American justice. Sentenced to death for the murder of his 3 daughters in a fire that he allegedly set, Willingham never confessed. On the contrary, he defended his innocence with all his strength from beginning to end. And his last words were more than an outburst. They were a direct, cutting accusation against the system that led to his execution. The phrase he shouted before dying was, "I am innocent. What you are about to do is murder. May God forgive you." There was no hesitation, there was no fear, there was anger, conviction, and a kind of desperation that, coming from someone guilty, would seem like theater. But coming from someone who may have been wronged, it's absolutely disturbing, and this possibility opens up a huge wound. Because if there was truth in his words, what was done that day was not just executing a man, it was burying justice under the appearance of a condemnation. Willingham's case became a landmark for deep reflection. Experts re-evaluated the evidence used to convict him, and many came to the conclusion that forensic methods at the time were flawed, based on mistaken interpretations of fire behavior. There was no concrete proof, just assumptions. And yet, he was executed. This exposes something that goes far beyond individual history. It reveals the behind the scenes of a system that sometimes makes mistakes, and makes mistakes irreversibly. This type of narrative affects our mentality because it dismantles the idea that everyone convicted is in fact guilty. And it forces us to face a hidden truth. Justice in some situations does not exactly seek the truth, look for culprits, seek quick answers, seeks to close cycles. And when haste or pressure speak louder than precision, the impact is devastating. If Willingham was telling the truth, and it appears he might have been, then what remained of that execution was not a sense of justice served, but a deep moral scar. A reminder that the truth can be ignored when it becomes inconvenient. And this transforms not only his story, but the way we look at each sentence, each trial, each decision made in the name of the law. Comment there. That makes sense to me. I want to understand how this kind of revelation hits you. Well, now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because after hearing these very different stories, from the repentant to the cold and calculating, from the religious to the one who screamed innocence, it's impossible not to ask yourself, is there any pattern, any invisible line that connects these last words, and above all, what they reveal about the mental state of someone facing their own death? The answer, although complex, leads us to discover something fascinating about human behavior in extreme situations. Each final sentence is not just a goodbye. It is a mirror of what really existed inside the minds of these individuals. Criminal psychology points out that the moment of execution reveals much more than most people imagine. It's as if there, on the edge between life and death, all the masks fell or in some cases were exchanged for others that were even better calculated. Some criminals demonstrate apparently sincere repentance, almost as an attempt to achieve some form of redemption before the end. Others, as we have seen, remain cold, distant, reinforcing the trait of emotional indifference so characteristic of psychopathy. The use of religion, for example, is a frequent pattern. But the way it appears changes completely from case to case. It could be a genuine search for forgiveness, a last hope for transformation, or simply a strategy to appear more human in the final minutes. There are also those who refuse to collaborate with the execution ritual, who challenge, confront, accuse. In these cases, what is observed is behavior that may be linked to the perception of injustice or an extreme need for control, as if, even in the face of death, they still need to assert power over something. What is curious is that even in the differences, there is a common point. They all reveal in some way the type of internal narrative that these people maintained until the end. Some die still trying to prove their truth, others denying any responsibility, and some simply embracing the end as an inevitable outcome. This not only gives us clues about each person's psychological profile, but also about how human beings deal with their own finitude when they are forced to face it head-on, with no more time for escape or denial. And what all of this shows us, deep down, is that these final sentences, however short they may be, are never just loose words. They carry weight, context, decisions, and even emotional backgrounds that often didn't come to light before. It is at that moment that the criminal is no longer just the defendant or the condemned. He is, for seconds, the narrator of his own journey, with all that this involves. Guilt, pride, fear, or in some cases, a disconcerting absence of any emotion. Write it in the comments. I'm on this journey too. I want to know how this all resonates with you. Let's go further on this subject, bringing some curiosities that will leave you even more perplexed. Because believe it or not, some of the last words or actions of criminals were not at all what you expected. Sometimes reality can be even more surreal than any fiction. Did you know that, in some cases, killers not only remained calm until the end, but even made jokes? Well, one of the best known and extremely cold criminal, after being sentenced to death, was not intimidated in the slightest and made a joke. In court, as if he were there just for a simple trial without the weight of a final sentence. He turned to the judge and said a disconcerting sentence, "Well, I've been in more complicated situations." The coldness with which he dealt with his imminent execution is enough to leave anyone shocked. How can someone act with so much disdain towards the end of their own life? And there's more. There's a story that seems more like a movie than reality. One of the most feared criminals in the United States, who was sentenced to death, surprised everyone by ordering a pizza. That's right. During his last meal, he ordered a pizza as if he were ordering a regular snack. Of course, the request was granted, but the gesture was marked in the memory of everyone who was present. What goes on in the mind of someone who, faced with death, decides to ask for something so simple, almost trivial, as if it were any routine? And don't think that the surprises stop there. Another, even more impressive case involved a murderer who, instead of showing any kind of regret or emotion, sang a popular song before being executed. Completely impassive, he sang with the same lightness he would have during a concert, without any sign of remorse, as if he were just fulfilling a commitment. This attitude undoubtedly had a profound impact on everyone who was present. It was as if he was turning one of the most dramatic moments in history into something personal, almost intimate. These episodes are just some of the many reactions that, at first glance, seem disconnected, but which, if analyzed more carefully, offer us valuable clues about the mental state of a criminal in the final moment. What these moments reveal to us, in fact, is how complex the human mind can be, and in many cases, completely unpredictable, even in the face of death. Comment there. That makes sense to me. How do these reactions impact your perception of human behavior in moments of extreme pressure? Now, after exploring these different facets of human behavior in the final moments, I want you to reflect for a moment. Are these final words, these last sentences, really sincere confessions or pure manipulation until the last second? How can we truly understand what goes on in the mind of someone who is about to lose everything? Sometimes the line between genuine regret and a last-ditch attempt at manipulation is so thin that it becomes almost impossible to identify. And perhaps deep down, we all wonder, to what extent is it possible to believe in a person who finds themselves facing the end when the only thing left is one last chance to express themselves? Human psychology is complex, especially when we are dealing with people in extreme situations. These last words are, in some way, a reflection not only of their lives, but also of their choices, their traumas, and even their internal struggle. Each of these stories, though tragic and disturbing, offers us a unique insight into human nature, into what can happen when the pressure is unbearable, when the weight of a lifetime finally falls on someone's shoulders. I know you must be thinking, but what would be right, fair, in each of these cases? Did any of these criminals deserve a second chance? Or perhaps, deep down, we are all just trying to understand how far individual responsibility can be justified in a situation as extreme as death? Each story raises more questions than it answers, and that's precisely what makes these cases so fascinating. The hidden truth behind these last moments makes us question our own morality and how far society should go to right the wrongs of the past. Now I want to hear from you. Which of these stories impacted you the most? What do you think of each of these last words? Do you believe any of them deserved a second chance, or was their fate sealed? Comment below what you think about all this. And of course, if this content made you reflect, don't forget to leave a like to show that this type of conversation really touches you. And if you want to continue on this journey of discovery and explore these intense cases even further, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss the next videos. Let's continue exploring the deeper side of the human mind together. Comment there. That makes sense to me, or I'm on this journey too. If you got this far, it's because the conversation was intense and deep, right? And I really hope you connected with the stories and reflections we brought. If this content made sense to you, I would love to hear your opinion. Comment, I'm with you until the end. This simple gesture will show me that you are on this journey of discovery, too. Oh, and if you liked the video and think that these discussions deserve to be seen by more people, leave a like to support and continue this exchange of ideas. That makes all the difference. And if you still want more, there's a video here that complements this topic and will take you even deeper into this topic. Click there and come with me to continue this reflection. See you in the next